Okay. And on the opposite end of the market structure from perfect competition, we have a pure monopoly. Okay. And the characteristics of a pure monopoly is that there is a single seller or a sole producer of a product, and that product is unique. There are not close substitutes for it. So if the consumer does not buy the monopolist product, then he cannot find a similar product anywhere else. He chooses to forego having that product at all. They are a price maker. Since they are the sole producer, they have control over price and can charge whatever price they like to maximize their profits. There are also strong barriers to entry. It's difficult for other firms to enter the industry. It could be due to, for example, it could be a patent on a certain product. The barriers could be economic. For example, like in a natural monopoly, it would be cheaper for there to be just one firm servicing that certain good or or service than multiple firms. It could be technological, etc. And it's also have non-price competition. Okay, so a monopolist with standardized products engage in public relations advertising. Those with differentiated products will sometimes advertise the differences in their goods, but okay, some examples of monopoly. Public utility companies, these are usually natural monopolies. The government allows them because they experience economies of scale. It's cheaper for them to service the population, just for one company to service the population, than it would be for multiple firms to service the population. There are also near monopolies, and these are firms that own a majority of the market share. So, for example, Intel owns about 80% of microprocessors used in personal computers. Also, professional sports teams. They're monopolies because they're the sole suppliers of a service in a large area. So usually, each major city has one baseball team, one football team, one basketball team. It's rare that they have more than one team for the same sport. There are also geographical monopolies. Basically, if it's a very small town, then they might just need one dry cleaner, one grocery store, for example. As mentioned before, one of the characteristics of a monopoly is barriers to entry. Barriers to entry is any factor that are preventing other firms from entering the industry. Once again, it could be due to economies of scale. Usually, that's why a government will grant, for example, a public utility firm to have a monopoly in that area, because a monopoly will operate on economies of scale. Of course, in exchange for allowing a monopoly, they will get regulated. Also, there could be legal barriers like patents and licenses. Or the monopolist could control essential resources like De Beers. They own a big, significant amount of the diamond mines. And therefore, they have a huge influence in the diamond industry and on prices of diamonds. Also, at one point, the International Nickel Company of Canada controlled 90% of the world's nickel reserves. Also, sometimes a firm will play dirty and slash their price so low that it drives existing firms out of business. Now, if the U.S. government found that they were purposely operating at a loss to drive other firms out of business, they could prosecute that firm. So it's a very risky strategy. Some people have accused Walmart of doing that and driving local mom and pop shops out of business. Also, another famous case was when Microsoft was sued. Essentially, Microsoft charged consumers a higher price if they bought a Windows operating system with Netscape as their web browser than if they bought the operating system with Microsoft's own Internet Explorer, and the government ruled against Microsoft and said that was indeed illegal, and that they were trying to create a monopoly on the Internet Explorer by charging a higher price for systems that came with Netscape. The government will grant a natural monopoly to a firm that operates on economies of scale. So let's say it's a very small town, and you can see here that the more houses they service, the lower the average total cost is. And so let's say if there were two firms and they each service 100 houses, and the average total cost would be 15. But if one firm could service 200 houses, all 200 houses, and the average total cost would be 10. So the government says, okay, this lowers cost for consumers. We will let you operate as a monopoly, but in exchange, we will regulate you. Monopoly demand differs from the purely competitive firm because in a monopolistic structure, there is only one seller. Therefore, the monopolist is the industry. The demand curve is downward sloping because the monopolist knows that in order to sell more units, they have to charge a lower price. Or if they want to charge a higher price, then they will not sell as many units. And since the demand curve is downward sloping, that means prices are different for all quantities, and therefore marginal revenue will be less than price. For a purely competitive firm, price stayed the same at all levels of production, especially in the short run, and therefore marginal revenue was the same for every unit sold. In this case, since prices are changing, marginal revenue will be less than the price. And we'll illustrate this in the next slide. Okay, so here we have some revenue and cost data for the different quantities of output. So the monopolist, for example, let's say wants to charge 172, but no one would buy the output. So in this case, they would incur their fixed costs and have a profit loss of 100. Okay, let's say they supply one unit at 162. Okay, the total revenue would be 1 times 162. And their marginal revenue, okay, here is the change in total revenue from supplying an additional unit of output. So it would be 162. It's the difference between total revenue going from 0 to 1. Their total cost is 190. So total revenue of 162 minus total cost of 190 is a profit loss of 28. Okay. They could sell 2 units at a price of 152. Okay. So total revenue then is 304. So marginal revenue is 142 because supplying one more unit, so going from 1 to 2, changed total revenue by 142. Okay. And we see here that the profit would be 34. And then so on. So total revenue for 3 units would be 426. The marginal revenue is 122. Okay. And we also see here marginal cost. What's the change in total cost from supplying one additional unit? Okay. And what we find here is that profit is maximized when marginal revenue most closely equals marginal cost, which would be at unit 5, and profit is maximized. So in this case, it is very similar to the purely competitive firm, where profit maximization occurs at marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now what's different is for the purely competitive firm, price equaled marginal revenue, but in this case, we see here that marginal revenue has been less than price. Okay, it starts off the same here, but then you could see that price is higher than marginal revenue over here. So the monopolist will produce the profit maximizing output, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then they will charge the price for that output, which is higher than marginal revenue. So we will illustrate this in the graph. Okay, and this graph helps illustrate the downward sloping demand curve of the monopolist. So here, at this point, they could sell for $142 3 units. The monopolist knows that in order to sell more than 3 units, let's say they wanted to sell 4, they would have to lower their price to 132. Okay, so by lowering their price, they have a loss of $30, and that's because the first 3 units had to be sold for $10 less. So, before they could be sold for $142, now they're being sold for $132. So it's a loss of $10 each. But they also gain $132 because they sold a 4th unit for $142. So the change in marginal revenue going from 3 to 4 units would be 132 minus 30 equals 102. So we can see that marginal revenue is less than the price. The monopolists will set their price in the elastic region of the demand curve. Okay. So just like illustrated earlier, you could see that the marginal revenue curve of the monopolist is less than the demand curve, okay, for the reasons that we illustrated before, because in order for the monopolist to sell more units, they have to lower their price. Okay, if price is already low to begin with, let's see, then a change in price won't change demand by so much. Okay, so like example, if my coffee is $2 and it goes up to $2.05, okay, my demand for my coffee is not going to really change. But as price rises, then demand becomes more elastic. It becomes more sensitive to changes in price. So I'll be more sensitive to a good going from $300 to $350 than I would be from a good going from $2 to $2.05. Okay. So a quick review from chapter on elasticity. When demand is elastic, lowering price will increase total revenue. And when demand is inelastic, a price decreases total revenue. Okay, to look at profit maximizing output, price, and if there's any economic profit in monopoly, we have a series of steps. So the first thing we're going to do is find where marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost curve, and then we're going to draw a vertical line upward to the demand curve and then trace it back to the vertical axis, and that will determine the profit maximizing price. So we can find the profit this way. We can either do it by subtracting the average total cost of the profit maximizing output from the profit maximizing price, and then you will multiply the amount by the output. And, if it's a positive number, it's economic profit. If it's negative, it's a loss. Or the second method, I find it a little more complicated. I actually prefer method one. You can find total cost by multiplying the average total cost of the output. And then you find total revenue by multiplying the profit maximizing output by the profit maximizing price. And then you would subtract total cost from total revenue to determine if there's any economic profit. Okay, let's do an example using this graph. We have average total cost. And here we have marginal cost. Okay, so first we need to determine the output that will maximize profit. Okay, and so we find where marginal revenue, which is over here, okay, this gray line, intersects marginal cost. And we see that the profit maximizing output is 5. And now we draw a vertical line upward. When we hit the demand curve, we go to the left and we find that the profit maximizing price is 122. And the average total cost per unit when quantity is 5, okay, is 94. So what we can do to find economic profit is we have $122 of revenue per unit minus the cost per unit is 94. And we get a profit of $28 per unit sold times 5 units. So economic profit is 140. Some misconceptions with monopoly pricing is, people assume since they are a price maker and they're the only firm in that industry that they charge the highest price, but that is not true. They charge the price where profit is maximized. And if the price is too high, there could be a possibility of losses as well. Okay, let's look at a case where the monopolist is experiencing a loss. Okay, so we have average total cost over here. Marginal cost over here. And average variable cost. Okay. So again, the loss minimizing output in this case is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, so we're at output QM. And the loss minimizing price, we would trace this upward to where it hit the demand curve and go to the left. But the average total cost for that quantity produced is higher than the price. So the monopolist would minimize the loss if they operate or if they produce QM units at PM price. So in this case, you can see that the average total cost curve is higher than the demand curve. So the monopolists here would just want to minimize their loss, and they can do that by, once again, producing at a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, okay, and charging PM price. So one effect of a monopoly is a loss in efficiency. So in a perfectly competitive market, we are producing at an output where price equals marginal cost equals minimum average total cost. So the output would be higher, for example, than in a pure monopoly. If the pure monopoly was charging the same price as the purely competitive firm, okay, they would be over here. Let's draw the marginal cost curve. Okay, so they would be producing over here if they were charging the same price as a purely competitive firm. But the monopolists, okay, to maximize their profit, they are going to charge a price that is higher. So they look at where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. It's right here. So this will be the profit maximizing output. And this will be the profit maximizing price. So we see here, there is a loss of efficiency, okay, because the monopolist produces less output than the purely competitive firm. So there is a loss of surplus right here, this little triangle. Okay, some other economic effects that results from a monopoly. We have income transfer. Essentially, because the monopolist charges a higher price for their product than a purely competitive firm, then the consumer surplus is lost and is transferred as producer surplus to the monopolist. For a monopolist, economies of scale could be realized since they are the only firm that is providing a certain good or service. They are able to service the whole market, and so the more they service, the lower their average total cost per unit is. Also, simultaneous consumption. For example, one firm could satisfy a large number of consumers. So Microsoft produces its Windows program only once, so it has a low cost because then millions of consumers are using that program. It could also create a network effect where the value of a product increases the more people start using it. So for example, like the more people you start using Facebook, the higher value Facebook is. Remember how MySpace used to be very popular and then Facebook came along. So it seems Facebook is one of the few dominant social networks as well, and nobody really uses MySpace that much anymore. Also, we assume that the monopolist produces at a point where average total cost is minimized per unit, but that doesn't always happen. And when a monopolist is producing output that its cost is above the minimum average total cost, then they are at X in efficiency. Even though it reduces profits, it occurs, it could be because of nepotism, giving incompetent friends or family the job, and so cost is not minimized. It could be because management has different goals, and so they're not engaging in cost reducing behavior, etc. Sometimes monopolists engage in rent seeking behavior, and This is when they want to transfer income or wealth to a firm or a resource supplier at someone else's expense. So a firm might go through great lengths to keep their monopolist status, going through the government, trying to get exclusive licenses, legislations, hire lawyers to do so, and so that drives up their costs. Some economists would say that a monopolist does not have as high of an incentive to acquire and implement new technology or even innovate, because since they are their sole supplier, and technology innovation would increase their costs. But others will say that sometimes the monopolists own a new technology, and that is a barrier to entry. No one else has that technology. And so they will continue to innovate, and this will keep potential competitors away. Okay, an example of X inefficiency. Okay, let's see, average total cost. Okay, so if a firm, for example, at Q2, if their average total cost should be ATC2, but instead it's X over here, ATCX then they are at X inefficiency. And then same here at Q1, they should be operating at ATC1, but instead they're operating at ATCX. So they're operating at a cost higher than it should be. So economists are concerned about monopolies because, again, since it is one firm supplying that good or service, they charge higher prices. There's a deadweight loss associated. It stifles competition and innovation. Since there is no competition, there's no need to innovate and keep new technology coming. So, some policy options, there's antitrust laws, and the government could break up monopolies, or they could prevent firms from merging and becoming a monopoly as well. Or if the government deems that it's a natural monopoly, then they can regulate it and determine the price at a certain quantity. Or they can just let the monopoly be and hope that time and markets will introduce competitors, which would change the market structure from monopoly to monopolistic competition. Also, because of foreign trade, there might be one supplier of a certain good or service in the U.S., but because we can import from foreign firms, the monopolist power is reduced. So we can get chemicals from Bayer, which is a German company, or Daimler. Okay, we can get automobiles there. And so since we can import these goods, then U.S. industries have less power and more incentive to innovate. We can get tires from France, electronics from China, and so on. So price discrimination is when firms charge a different price to different buyers. It's not necessarily illegal, but it does help the monopolists capture more profit and surplus. For price discrimination to be successful, the seller needs to be a monopolist or have a great degree of control over output and price. Also, the firm needs to be able to segregate their market. Basically, they need to know, which buyers will pay what price. So often, they'll know that senior citizens oftentimes are living on fixed incomes, and so they know that they can charge a lower price in order to capture their business. And also for students as well, are on a quote-unquote student budget, and so their willingness to pay for goods is lower, and so the monopolist could charge a student discount as well. And another condition is that there's no resale. The buyer of that good or service cannot resell that product, because then it would undermine the monopolist's attempt for price discrimination. So some examples of price discrimination would be business travelers. Airlines know that business travelers have an inelastic demand. Their company's paying for it. They need the workers to conduct business, so they can charge a higher price. Whereas leisure travelers are a lot more sensitive to higher prices, so they can charge them a lower price. And they distinguish it a lot of times by looking at what days the travel days are. Leisure travelers tend to go on trips over the weekend, business travelers during the week. Also, movie theaters, they'll charge a lower price for a matinee, trying to attract, for example, senior citizens or students who have lower willingness to pay, and capture their business. And they'll charge, premium prices during like weekend nighttime shows. Railroad companies would charge the shippers of more valuable resources a higher price per ton than shippers of less valuable resources. Also, coupons, people who have the time and necessity to clip coupons tend to have a lower income, and so, firms are trying to capture that business. International trade too. So let's say a foreign producer wants to sell their resource in the United States, and they already know that the United States have several sellers of that same resource, so they'll charge the United States a lower price than they would charge, let's say, Brazil. Let's say Brazil doesn't have any firms in their country producing that resource, and so they know that their demand is more inelastic. Okay, so looking at a graph where price discrimination is practiced. Okay, on the left, we have the monopolist selling to a small business whose demand is inelastic, not very sensitive to price. So the monopolist can get away with charging a higher price, and therefore they earn a higher economic profit. On the right, okay, let's say they're selling a good to students, and they know the students' willingness to pay and ability to pay is much lower, and so the students' demand for a good is much more elastic, and so the monopolist charges a lower price and therefore earns less economic profit. Okay, natural monopolies, since they are granted a monopoly status by the government, they are subject to rate regulations. However, if competition is possible, then they could be deregulated. Okay, so the government could regulate the monopolies and have them set their price equal to marginal cost, which would be the socially optimal price. It is the same price that would be charged if the market structure was perfectly competitive, and that way total surplus is maximized. Or they could set price equal to average total cost, because the socially optimal price might not cover all the costs and the monopolist could be experiencing a loss, so they could instead set price to equal average total cost, which would still be lower than if the monopolist were to charge a price higher than average total cost to earn economic profits. Okay, so let's say the monopolist price is over here, and we have average total cost here. So this would be, there you go in green, the economic profit from monopolist price. Okay. Okay, if they were to charge a fair return price, then they would break even over here, And a socially optimal price in this case, okay, would cause a loss. Okay, because average total cost is higher than the price. So in this case, the regulator would want the monopoly to charge a fair return price. So monopoly power in the internet age, Google is by far the most used search engine. There's other ones like Bing, but Google is the primary search engine that is used. Google spends a lot of money on research and development to keep their search engine ahead of the game. Facebook dominates social media, though I would say Instagram. Well, Instagram's owned by Facebook, so Facebook dominates social media. Amazon has been incredible in staying top of their game as an online retailer. Barriers to entry are network effects. Now that it seems everyone's on Facebook, to join another social media site, it takes a lot of work for everyone to sign up and then get reconnected and reestablish, and you see little things on Facebook like, it says like on this day 5 years ago you did this and this, and people like that. They don't want to erase their whole history by joining a whole new social media network. And also, these companies benefit from economies of scale. For example, Amazon has a giant server farm, and that helps them keep their costs lower per sale than if their server farm was smaller. All right, and this concludes Chapter 25, Monopoly.